Okay, we rolling. Ready? As someone who is a legend in the fighting game scene, what was something you got a deeper appreciation of within game development and or the fighting game scene as a whole after joining a dev team and working on a game directly?
Sure. Yeah, this is a good one. So I guess coming into fighting game development after being a competitive player for many years is really funny, because if I think about some of the aspects of different fighting games that really shaped my time with them, most of the things that define a game or really characterize it for competitive play are not the kinds of things that are usually super well thought out or super planned by developers. And in general, game development is the kind of thing where the more time you spend on something, the more you usually care about that thing, or the more important that thing is to the experience. So if I think about games like Capcom vs. SNK 2, there's a bunch of stuff in that game, like roll cancels, which is a glitch that lets you make any special move invincible if you have a roll. Or some of the custom combos, like Dictator's Paint the Fence combo or Sakura's Show, where those aren't really things that it felt like the dev team spent a whole lot of time on. In some cases, they were a bug or some emergent gameplay that showed up, and they define the way that game is played at the high level. You're either doing that stuff or you're learning how to beat people who are doing that stuff. But they're not things that were intended to be in the game in quite that way, or they weren't meant to carry that much weight of the player experience. Now, if you think about it for a second, this is obvious. High-level play is something that is experienced by a very small number of players. And so if you are a developer on a dev team and you're trying to make a game that is financially successful enough to make another game and more games after that, you have to spend more of your time designing for the average player experience. Not necessarily just low-skill play per se, but the kind of play that isn't about wanting to win EVO, for example. This is true for any software development. You're expected to spend most of your time on stuff that's going to affect the biggest number of people who are using your software. And for fighting games, that usually means playing up the fantasy of the fighting game. So it's stuff like, does this character look cool? Are their animations satisfying? Do their attacks generally connote how you'd want to use them, right? A fireball is obvious because you see that hitbox traveling across the screen. But for some attacks which have extended hitboxes or hurtboxes, if they're set up in a way that is optimal for a certain gameplay outcome, that might not be what's best for the average inexperienced player who's just using them and trying to see what happens. So it's not like high-level play isn't important to developers, because obviously if someone is watching the game and they're watching people who are really good at the game, you want people who are good at the game to look like they're having fun, they're doing something cool that makes other people want to play the game and get good at it too. So there is a certain amount of work that you have to be able to spend on making high-level play look compelling, especially now. This obviously wasn't the case as much for something like CVS2 because we didn't have live video streams of video games back then. But you can't spend as much time on high-level play as you can on the average player experience, simply because most people are not going to be experiencing the high-level stuff. So when I got into game development, I thought I was going to be spending more time on designing fighting games for people who understand that fighting games are a collection of rules, right? The people who count frames, the people who look at hitboxes, the people who take fighting games as a cool machine and try and take them apart to figure out what the best way to win is. But in actuality, most people who play fighting games aren't like that at all. They mostly just want to see cool stuff happen on screen. Yeah, there is some competition and rivalry with their friends, but it rarely goes into the depths of training mode or the depths of intentional practice, for example. Most people who touch a fighting game have no idea what's going on with them inside. And that's actually kind of true for video games in general. Most video games are built to offer their players an experience which doesn't make you think about how the video games work underneath. And for fighting games, especially for really dedicated players, all we care about is how it works underneath. We care about the hitboxes, we care about the frames, we care about the weird little things that a developer did, probably never thinking anyone would look at them, because that's how we treat the game as an object of mastery, an object to be studied and practiced and eventually refined until we're really, really good at it. And you can kind of tell that this is the case because when you look at games that are made by teams or people which have pretty deep fighting game experience as players, they often make a lot of stuff that is really refined and nuanced on like the nerdy stuff, right? Really exciting systems that are fun to play with once you understand them all. Really well-designed attacks that have their hitboxes and hurt boxes placed in the exact right place to generate the outcomes they know they want. But you can look at the fighting game fantasy aspect of the game, and often it's lacking a little bit. It doesn't feel like it's as ridiculous or as outlandish as games that are made by people who mostly love how fights look. And actually, my experience with fighting game developers is kind of similar to fighting game players. You get a lot of people who really are invested in how the fighting game looks, and then you get a lot of people who are really invested in how the fighting games play. And in a lot of cases, people are really good at attuning themselves to one side of the equation or the other, but can't really do both that well. And that was the case for me. I had to learn a lot about what makes fighting games satisfying for people who do not care what's going on under the hood. And the more I've worked in fighting games, the more that aspect actually has become interesting to me, because any given fighting game can have all kinds of weird details in it for the hardcore players, but you're often not building just for the hardcore players because there aren't that many of them. So you have to learn how to build systems and characters and moves and combat that show the inexperienced players a good time. They show them something really cool, but also still have the kind of depth and room for mastery to attract long-term hardcore players. And that balance, hitting that balance, is extremely difficult. I think the way that I would describe it is it's kind of like having to make something that is both an entertaining martial arts movie as well as a real competitive practical sport in the same thing. And if you're a martial arts fan, you've seen the split between those two for decades at this point. When you watch a martial arts movie, there's a lot of elaborate choreographed action in there that looks really cool, and it's designed to look really good on camera. But most of that stuff isn't combat practical. And then if you go and watch a mixed martial arts contest, some of that stuff might look really boring to you, right? Someone gets taken down and then they just get the shit beaten out of them on the ground for like 5 minutes or whatever. Or maybe they're just grappling up against the cage and like trading elbows and stuff. That can be really practical. It's obviously tested in this sport where people are trying to win, but it doesn't look as cool as John Wick. So yeah, having to do both and having to understand all the different things that bring people to fighting games ended up being really, really interesting to me. I still think that the high skill play, design and refinement and understanding is the really cool stuff for me personally as a player. I am very much a person who cares more about the crunchy systems and the way that the combat works and that kind of stuff than I am the visual and aesthetic presentation of how that combat goes. But the thing about systems is that ultimately they're for nerds. So as long as you just come up with a bunch of complicated stuff, nerds will usually, at least some nerds will kind of dig into it and they'll think it's cool and whatever, and they get to have a good time. But designing for someone who doesn't really care about that stuff and still wants to have a good time ended up being a far bigger test of my ability to understand what makes fighting games compelling for people in general. So yeah, it's a weird one. It's not what I expected, but it was super fun, and it continues to be super fun to learn more of every day. Thanks for asking. Good question.